God, it was an unforgettable day, I can tell you that. By all accounts, it was a typical Saturday night dinner. Even young Rachel was there, who, as was often the case, was staying with us for the weekend. I suppose I'd better explain why Rachel was there. Rachel's mother, Andorra, who, incidentally, I hadn't met at the time, was a widow and worked almost every weekend as a dispatcher in a taxi cab. Otterly and Rachel had become best friends back in high school, and they had often slept over at each other's houses ever since. Eventually, it became standard procedure. Rachel slept over on Fridays and Saturdays while her mother worked 12-hour night shifts and carved out a few hours to sleep during the day. Marge, Otterly's mother and my ex-wife, obviously knew Andorra well, but to be honest, I never saw her at the time, not for any special reasons that I can name, unless Marge thought that beautiful Andorra would turn my head. It was just the way things were. I was traveling a lot at the time. The company I was working for was young, and we were trying to grab a piece of a market that had been tightly filled by other suppliers for years. As it happened, Marge was constantly dropping off and picking up the kids. On Sundays, however, Rachel was often picked up from our house in any of the cabs that passed by. I think Rachel liked the cab drivers to spoil her with candy, ice cream, etc. However, Otterly didn't mind when they came to pick Rachel up. She usually got the same treats they did. Where was I? Oh yes, that infamous Saturday night dinner. The four of us were sitting around the table eating. Marge had just served us sweets, and I think I had just returned to the table after putting away the main course dishes in the kitchen. Anyway, without thinking about the fact that there were two girls sitting with us, and without any prior warning or preparation, Marge suddenly announced, "Pete, I want a divorce. I'm leaving you." She then settles on her lover as if she hadn't dropped the biggest brick she could think of on my head. Excuse me. I think that was the end of my reaction. When your wife of 10 years suddenly makes a statement like that in a conversation, your first reaction is to wonder if your ears have been deceived. I said I want a divorce. I found someone else and I want to spend the rest of my life with him. What the hell am I supposed to say to a statement like that? Not forgetting, of course, that there were two impressionable 8-year-old girls sitting at the table with us, one of whom was our daughter, watching my every word and/or physical action. I believe that under the circumstances, I displayed that day the exceptional self-control and patience of a saint. Upon reflection, I have always been proud of the self-control I displayed. I sat for a while, going over Marge's words in my mind, until I convinced myself that I wasn't crazy, that she had simply said she wanted me out of her life. I must have made some stupid statement like, "If that's the case, I'm going apartment hunting tomorrow," or something like that. Remember, I was in a state of shock at the time, so my recollection of the details is probably somewhat skewed. Anyway, I said something about going to move out of the house, but Marge retorted by saying, "No, you should keep the house. I don't need it and you need it for Otterly." I stopped pretending to eat the rapidly melting ice cream on my plate and stared at Marjorie. "We're going on a trip around the world, and Otterly at her age can't afford to miss all her schoolwork," Marge added nonchalantly, not even lifting her eyes from her plate. "You've got to be kidding me, right?" I replied in a rather loud voice. I held back my emotions, not for Marge's sake, but for the sake of the two impressionable girls sitting at the table with us. Upon reflection, Marge probably decided to make her statement during the meal because she knew full well that I would hold back in the presence of children. "I want to see the world while I'm still young enough to enjoy it," Marjorie replied, completely unaware of the irony in her words. At this point, the words failed me, and if it weren't for the seriousness of the situation, I might well have burst into laughter. You see, when Marge and I first met, I was very much into traveling. I grew up with the plan that when I got my engineering degree, I would travel the world for a few years before settling down. When Marge came into my life, I saw no need to change that plan. I envisioned Marge and I traveling to exotic places together. Marge, however, saw things a little differently. Yes, like me, she dreamed of seeing the world, the Grand Canyon, the Rocky Mountains, and the huge redwood trees that grow there. We even talked about places like Ayers Rock in Oz and the North Island of New Zealand with its boiling mud pools and stuff. My New Zealand buddy often told us about his ski trips to the South Island. It always sounded fun, at least a little more exotic than the Alps. But Marge had a slightly different plan of action than I did. I assumed we'd get married and leave as soon as we got our degrees, using the savings she and I had stashed away. I assumed we'd travel for a couple of years and then come back to the UK, settle down, and have kids. That's assuming that while traveling we didn't find another place we wanted to settle. Marge planned to have children first, ironically, while I'm young enough to enjoy them. That's exactly what she said. Irony or what? At the time, I thought I understood Marge's position. Her parents were already quite old when her mother gave birth to her, and she was always aware of that fact. Anyway, Marge's idea was that once the kids were out of the nest, we would travel the world together. Apparently, Marge had changed her mind. Perhaps taking care of Otterly wasn't as much fun as she thought it would be. I know the pregnancy and the birth itself was not to her liking. The idea of having 3 children was quickly dropped from the master plan as soon as Otterly was born, and was not discussed much with anyone, as far as I know. I think I almost broke down at that point, but I couldn't laugh out loud, even though in retrospect I should have. I couldn't sit there listening to Marge's ramblings any longer, or I'm sure I would have snapped and done something I regretted for a long time afterward. I simply got up from the table and went out into the garden, where for some reason, perhaps out of habit or because it was just a job that had to be done, I began to prune the roses. I don't know how long it was before I realized I had company. First, I noticed Rachel's hand. I think she had started pruning the bush next to the one I was working on. Then I noticed Otterly working on the bush on the other side of me. Neither girl uttered a word to signal their arrival. "Careful with the thorns, girls, you're not wearing gardening gloves," I automatically warned. "We'll be careful, Daddy," Otterly replied. "What does your mom do?" I asked as if offhandedly. I don't know why I asked my daughter that, but it was another automatic answer. "I think she's upstairs packing." Otterly answered calmly, as if it was a normal thing to do. Suddenly, I was so angry again that I couldn't keep trimming those damn roses. I was afraid that if I did, I would rip off the live flowers too. I stepped back and watched the girls. I really wanted to rush upstairs and kick Marjorie out, but not so much because she had suddenly announced that she was leaving me. Rather because she had effectively declared to our daughter that she didn't want Otterly to ride with her. I couldn't understand how any mother, much less my wife, could do that to her child. "I'm sorry, Otterly," I said without further explanation. "Why, Daddy, it wasn't you who decided to leave us, but Mommy?" My daughter replied, obviously realizing the meaning of my apology. "Most of the kids at school are their dads who left. I'd rather stay with a dad who loves me than a mom who—" Otterly didn't finish the sentence, and I'm still wondering what she meant to say. I've always wondered, but I suppose I'll never know what I've missed over the years. Could Marjorie have somehow let Otterly know that she didn't love her? Marge always seemed to me to be a loving mother to Otterly. She also seemed to tenderly care for Rachel when she was in the house. But if I was blind enough not to notice that my wife had a gorgeous man stashed away somewhere, I had to wonder what else I was missing. But perhaps Marjorie Otterly's words were saying that her mother didn't love her just because she hadn't taken Otterly with her. Suddenly I noticed that both girls were working on the same rosebush together. What's more, they were holding hands. One was plucking dead rose heads, while the other was taking them from her and throwing them into a basket. Almost at the same moment, I realized that I could hear Marjorie talking to someone, probably her new man, on the telephone in the bedroom. The windows were open because the day was warm. I couldn't hear what she was saying to him, but knowing that children often have much better hearing than adults, I figured the girls could probably handle it. "Ice cream," I announced loudly. "Come on, girls, let's get ourselves the biggest ice cream we can find, huh?" I knew they had just had ice cream for dessert. My own melted when I put it on my plate, but it was the best idea my confused brain could come up with on such short notice. Both girls burst into shouts of joy and seemed to forget about the roses and start cheering each other up. I had never noticed this before. I found myself walking to the car with 8-year-old girls bouncing on either side of me, each holding onto one of my hands. To make the holiday even more special, I didn't take the girls to one of the local fast food places. Our town doesn't have a proper ice cream store. Instead, I went to one of the many restaurants in our town and ordered their ice cream sundaes to eat in the desert. I doubted any of the kids would be able to finish it. How wrong I was. It took them a while to get the hang of it, and that proved to be helpful to me. I began to get over the shock of Marjorie's sudden announcement and come to terms with what Marge was doing to us, and evaluating what the immediate and long-term consequences would be. For some inexplicable reason, I found that I personally don't care that Marjorie is leaving. Yes, I will miss her, but all my love for this woman was instantly shattered by her announcement and the way she did it in front of Otterly. But with her leaving, I had a big problem: childcare. I was sure I could look after Otterly, but I needed someone to drive her to and from school every day. I was sure my employers would help in any way they could, but our work hours are 9 to 5 and school hours are 9 to 3. And who the hell would look after Otterly during the vacations? Rachel? Well, I was sorry, but I had my own problems and her mother had to deal with hers as best she could. I remember thinking that I would have to call her later and explain the situation. The only option that came to my mind was my sister. Carol lived pretty far away, but maybe she could somehow pick Otterly up from school in the afternoons, even if it meant a long drive for both of us. The only drawback I could see was Carol's kids. Maybe they were graduating at the same time as Otterly. I pulled out my cell phone and called Carol. Maybe if I put the ball in her hands, she'd come up with some kind of plan. Carol was always pretty good at this sort of thing. "What did she do?" shouted Carol into the receiver while I explained Marjorie's statement as briefly as possible, trying not to go into details, what I knew of them, since the girls were sitting at the table with me. I myself was surprised at how little I had learned from what Marjorie had told me. I had no idea how long her affair had lasted, and I didn't even know who she was having it with. "Carol, I told you Marge ran off with some guy and left us." "Who? What guy?" Carol asked. "I have no idea, Carol, just some Casanova she picked up somewhere, I guess." I didn't bother to ask. "His name is Ronald," Otterly announced, taking me by surprise. "He's a library customer," Rachel added, not wanting to fall behind. Marge had been working part-time at the library for a few months now. "Just to make money and get out of the house," she said. I stared at the two girls who were still sitting there nonchalantly devouring their giant popsicles while simultaneously repeating Carol's words. "But my problem is this, Carol. I have no idea what I'm going to do about picking up Otterly from school every day. I can drop her off in the mornings and get to the office a little later, but there's no way I can end each day at 2:30. "It's okay, Daddy. Rachel's mom will pick me up from school." Otterly pointed this out with the logic of a child, and before Carol could respond, "It wouldn't be fair to ask her to do that every day, Otterly," I tried to explain to the child. "Oh, that won't be a problem," Otterly informed me. "We've thought of everything, haven't we, Rachel?" Rachel looked up from her ice cream, nodded, and then smirked at me. I realized for the first time that these two girls were quietly conspiring with each other. But where they found the time or opportunity that day, I had no idea. "Rachel will be staying at our house on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday," Otterly explained, "and I'll be staying with Rachel and her mom for the rest of the school nights. You can drive us to school on Mondays, and Rachel's mom will pick us up when she gets out of bed after lunch." Otterly threw me one of those childishly satisfied, easy and simple, problem-solved looks. I don't know what expression was on my face as I sat there in amazement. However, Carol must have overheard Otterly's words because she said, "I think it's a brilliant plan, Pete. Did you ask her?" "No, Carol, for some reason it didn't occur to me. I've never met Rachel's mother, and the idea never crossed my mind. Frankly, I have no idea if she would agree to it. It's too big a request. The cab driver has been asking my mom to work on Sundays for a while now." Rachel suddenly joined the conversation. "Mom said that by working on Sundays in the cab, she'd get more money than at the store. But she didn't want to impose on Otterly's mom by asking her to look after me." Reading between the lines of Rachel's words, I realized that her mother must be working part-time at the store during the week. God, this woman must be working around the clock, I thought to myself. I guess the kids solved your problem. What does Otterly's friend's mother look like? I have no idea. You know, I've never met the woman, Carol. I had to be careful what I said because I already knew that the two little innocent children sitting on the other side of the table were scrutinizing my every word. "Well, brother, I'd say you'd better get over there as soon as possible and have a chat with Rachel's mother to see what she thinks of the children's plan." Returning to the subject of Marjorie, Carol asked, "Has that bitch moved out of the house yet?" I have no idea, Carol. The girls and I are at a restaurant in town right now. I took them out for ice cream before I... Yeah, well, you know. But I think she was packing up when we left. I'd say you'd better get new door locks while you're in town. I'm sure you don't need the cow trying to come back. Call me later if you need anything tonight, Pete. Or Frank and I can come over later if you want. But if we both come, we'll have to bring the kids with us. Thanks, Carol, but I don't think that will be necessary. You know, I think all the help I'm going to need this evening is sitting here with me right now. The two girls grinned at each other, then at me, and finally greeted each other again. I was to see them do this many times over the next few months. Only at the time I had no idea what the little fools were really up to. Another thing I hadn't noticed was that not only was Carol not surprised to learn that Marjorie was leaving me, but she wasn't particularly upset about it. But I would never say that the two women got along well together, and they certainly couldn't be called close friends. After we finished our ice cream, we walked back to the car. But I didn't go home. I had a delicate mission to accomplish first. I had to inform Rachel's mother that I would be the only adult in the house with the girls that evening, and assure her that she didn't mind. There are some pretty strange personalities these days, and as far as I knew, Rachel's mother had never caught my eye. I pulled up outside the cab office and, leaving the girls in the car, went inside to find Rachel's mother. "My name is Pete Thomas, and I'm looking for young Rachel's mother." I turned to the cab driver sitting behind the counter, who I thought vaguely remembered picking Rachel up from her house one Sunday afternoon. This may seem strange, but at the time I had no idea what Rachel's mother's name really was. Both Marge and Otterly always called her Rachel's mom, and Rachel always called her mom. A few guys, obviously cab drivers on break, were sitting in old armchairs drinking tea or coffee. I felt like I was immediately the center of attention for all of them as soon as I mentioned Rachel. All attention was drawn to the TV playing in the corner of the office, and conversation stopped abruptly at the sound of her name. She was in her private office now and would be back shortly. The guy behind the counter smiled at me and gestured to a door with a "Ladies Only" sign on it, which, however, some weirdo had taped a piece of paper that read "Office Andorra." I stood and waited, trying not to show that I noticed that everyone was scrutinizing me. It seemed to take forever until the door finally opened and I got the surprise of a lifetime. I don't know how I expected to see Rachel's mother, but she certainly didn't look like she actually looked. Not that she was dressed to the highest standard. In fact, she was only wearing a pair of old jeans, very tight-fitting, and the same blue blouse that tightened her figure. But hell, she was one of those women who had the looks. The old bag might as well have suited her. Add to that flawless makeup, not too elaborate to emphasize her facial features, and not a single carelessly styled hairstyle. God, this woman looked like a runway model. She glided down the roads with the same grace, style, or whatever you want to call it, as they did. I realized why all these drivers were showing interest, asking me about her, and probably why they were all sticking around outside the cab office. "Andorra, there's a guy here to see you," the man behind the counter said. "Hey, Pete, is something wrong?" she asked with a wide smile on her face, but with perhaps a slightly concerned note in her voice. "Yeah. No, well, maybe," I replied, nervously looking around at all the guys who by then were pretending not to look or listen to us. "But Rachel's fine, and there's nothing to worry about. I just think I should let you know what's going on, that's all. Can we talk somewhere private?" Instantly, all the guys started getting up from their seats, apparently to go outside and leave us alone in the office. But Andor told them to stay, and we went outside. "What's up, Peter? Aren't you a little too smart?" Andor said as the door closed behind us. But then she spotted the girls huddled against the car window and waved at them. "Here's the problem. Andor, Marjorie left me." I stuttered. It felt really weird talking to her and even calling her Andor, since this was the first time we'd met. It also confused me that she recognized me immediately and knew who I was. I was sure we had never met before. "My goodness, you poor thing," was her first reaction. Then her mind must have realized the possible consequences. "Does this mean we have a babysitter problem today?" "Oh no, Andorra." I was still having trouble with that name. "It's just that we've never met, and I thought..." "Well, I don't know what I thought. I think you should know that I'll be watching the kids by myself tonight. I just thought you should know, after all, we're complete strangers." "Not really, Peter. Rachel talks about you all the time. You may not realize it, but she treats you like a surrogate father. She even has a picture of you along with a picture of my husband next to her bed." My God, where did she get that from? Otterly must have given it to her as a gift. "Anyway, do you want me to take the day off and take the girls or something?" "I can if you want to be alone." "Oh God, no. No, I just thought it would be wise to let you know about the bill. If they hadn't come this afternoon, I'd be at a complete loss. I'm fine looking after Rachel. I was just a little worried that you should know." I'm sure Rachel couldn't be in better hands, Peter. She reached out and took my hand, as if to emphasize it. "I'll come and get Rachel in the morning." "No, you need to get some sleep. 5 hours as usual will be just fine. But maybe you can stop by and see me on your own, because We really need to discuss what's going to happen in the future. If you want, I can bring Rachel home. Oh, yes. The future? I hadn't thought of that, Andorra replied, and an even more concerned expression appeared on her face. The possible long-term consequences of Marjorie leaving me must have suddenly crossed her mind. Don't worry, I think we can work something out. The girls are already full of ideas. I smiled at her as best I could. Andor looked a little relieved. Oh yeah, but I'll take Rachel. I'm sure you'll have plenty of things you need to focus on. Thanks, yes, I probably do. If only I can find them. I'll see you tomorrow night then, and please don't worry about Rachel. She's a wonderful girl. Aren't they both? Andor commented as we walked to the car where she had a word with the girls, kissing them goodnight and telling them to behave. When we pulled up to the house, there was an unfamiliar car in the driveway. Marjorie got out of it and stopped when I pulled up to the curb. Where have you been? I've been waiting here for you for hours, she demanded, after which she announced curtly that she was going to leave. Honestly, even after the bombshell she dropped on me earlier, I couldn't relate her behavior and speech to the woman I'd been married to for so long. If this is who I think it is, I suggest you tell that bastard to get his car out of my driveway before I move it for him. I replied just as sharply. I was indeed very close to the target, and I was extremely annoyed that Marjorie hadn't missed this guy when we got back. What a way to rub my nose in it, I thought. In retrospect, I think I had impeccable control of my emotions that day. Of course, mostly because the kids were around, but it seemed to me that Marjorie was trying to get me to confess. Perhaps she could use it as some sort of justification for her actions, if no one else did. Marjorie made a gesture with her hand, and the Jaguar started up with a roar, then pulled out of the driveway and parked across the street. Ignoring the fact that Marjorie was standing next to the car, I put the car in reverse and swung across the street to reverse into the spot where the Jag was parked. Marjorie complained that I almost hit her as I got out of the car. Oh, you're still here. I thought you left. I lied and walked toward the front door, but then I stopped and turned around to look at her. Aren't you taking this? I demanded, gesturing to the little Nissan that Marjorie usually drove. It suddenly occurred to me that the Jaguar was stuffed to the brim with Marjorie's stuff, while the Nissan was empty. I don't see the point, better sell it. We're flying out of the country on Wednesday, she replied. Where do I send the divorce papers? I thought. But Marge beat me to it. Ronnie's lawyer's address is on the kitchen table. He'll know where to contact us. She answered curtly, then turned to speak to Otterly, who, along with Rachel, had also gotten out of the car by then. I'm afraid I didn't wait to see what they had to say to each other, and my daughter and I have never discussed the subject since. But it couldn't have been anything special because, a few seconds later, both girls followed me into the house and shut the door tightly. What I didn't see but heard, somewhere in the back of my mind, was the distinct slap of their hands as the little devils exchanged greetings again. I'm afraid to say that I paid no attention to the sound at that moment. The girls and I settled down on the couch and watched a little TV, after which I told them that I thought it was time for them to go to bed. They both gave me a quick kiss on the cheek and then went to bed without argument. As I recall, this was a first on Otterly's part. I have no idea what time I eventually went to bed, although I admit to drinking a couple of glasses of whiskey that night to fall asleep. Sunday morning, I awoke to the familiar smell of frying bacon permeating the house. For a moment, I forgot that Marjorie had left and looked at the clock, wondering if she had gotten up early on Sunday. Then the memory of the day before came over me, and I looked around the room. Something was wrong or out of place, but for a few seconds I couldn't figure out what it was. And then it occurred to me that when I had gone to bed, there had been signs of Marjorie's departure everywhere. The drawers of the chest of drawers were half open, the closet doors ajar. Now, they weren't just closed. All signs that Marjorie had ever existed were gone from sight. Even the damned pictures of her mother and father, which I'd pointed out when I'd noticed her absence, weren't on the dressing table, now completely empty. I got out of bed and headed for the bathroom to do my usual ablutions, and to my even greater surprise, the personal items I was sure Marjorie had left there were gone too. I had to assume that, while I was asleep, I had had visitors come to put things in order, and I had only two possible culprits. Come on, Dad. Is breakfast getting cold? I heard Otterly call out to me from the stairs as I came out of the bedroom. Waiting for me in the kitchen were both 8-year-olds who insisted I sit down while they served them. I was served French fries with a glass of fresh orange juice and a cup of coffee, and served as if I were having breakfast in an expensive hotel. The two girls apparently settled for cornflakes, orange juice, and tea. I made the requisite enthusiastic remarks about the wonderful breakfast and the skill of the cooks, and was rewarded with broad smiles on both girls' faces. Carol, her husband Frank, and their children arrived before we had finished our meal. Their arrival disturbed the charm and tranquility a little, but it was obvious that their arrival had been anticipated, or the girls had grossly overestimated my coffee consumption, because Otterly and Rachel quickly set Carol and Frank's coffee mugs on the floor. It took me some coaxing to convince both girls to leave the dishwashing to me and go play with Carol's kids. Carol took care of the dishes, and Frank and I sat and drank coffee and watched them talk in detail about the day before. My sister and her husband said they would do whatever they could to help. Frank gave me the name and details of the attorney who represented his sister in the divorce. She turned out to be a good choice. Carol made dinner for everyone from what she found in the freezer and refrigerator. I think I spent most of the day tending to my roses when I wasn't talking to Carol and Frank. One thing I do remember, however, is that after dinner, Rachel and Otterly helped me do a little work on the roses, and I also remember Rachel, either by coincidence or on purpose, quoting a line from the song, "It's been a good year for the roses." I'm sure she was too young to realize the parallels that could be drawn between the song and the events of the previous day, but I certainly did. I'll never know if I reacted in any way when Rachel said those words. But I do know that, whether consciously or not, Rachel has repeated that phrase often over the years. Both girls seem to love the song itself, and we hear them playing and/or singing it quite often. Which is even weirder, especially if someone mentions Marjorie. The cab pulled up to the house around 4:30, and Andor got out of it. The girls let her into the house and we got to know each other. Then Carol, Andor, and I went into the living room, and Frank kicked all the children out into the garden and kept them busy. Andor felt sorry for me for what had happened, and before I could say anything, Carol informed Andor that the girls were going to babysit. Andor confirmed that she had mentioned to Rachel in passing that she had been asked to work the Sunday night shift as a checker at the cab stand, and said that she would get more money that way than she would for the 4 morning hours at the local convenience store where she worked. Almost without further discussion or much change, it was decided to follow the plan the children had outlined to me the night before, with some vague discussion that Carol would help with daycare for both girls, a couple days a week during school vacations, etc. Andor called the boss of the taxi company to see if she could pick up an extra shift. He was clearly over the moon and asked her to start work that evening. She looked at me for some reason for confirmation. I just smiled and nodded, so she agreed. But it didn't turn out to be that simple because Rachel needed school clothes for the next day. So Carol drove Andor and Rachel home to pick them up, and Otterly insisted on going with her. As I carried Rachel's bag into the house from Carol and Frank's car, a thought struck me. "Andor, do you drive?" I asked. "Yes, but since Tony left, I can't afford to keep a car," she replied. "How do you like the little Micra as a get-around car?" I asked. Andor stopped and looked at Marjorie's car parked by the road. "No," she replied. "Why not, since she doesn't need it? Didn't she tell me to get rid of the damn thing? You'll need it too, since you'll be racing Otterly to and from school every day." "Are you sure?" she asked. "Come on," I insisted. "Let's call the insurance company and put you on my policy as a driver. We'll put Marjorie on my policy too, and let Roland Rat handle her insurance." "His name is Ronald, Dad," Otterly corrected me. "Who cares what his name is? He's a Roland Rat to me." I replied, perhaps somewhat harshly. "He can't be Daddy, he's a Roland Rat, funny and cute." I was corrected. Well, you can't argue with my daughter's logic, so I agreed and changed things up a bit. "Okay, if you insist, it'll be Ronald the Rat." I smiled at her. For those not in the know, Ronald the Rat was a puppet character on a morning television news show at the time. Over the next few weeks, we all got used to the new routine. Although Carol, often with Frank and the kids, would show up on Saturday mornings to check the contents of the pantry and advise me to restock. She usually finished cooking and had lunch unless we went out to eat. And yes, it's true. Carol never actually wore white gloves, but she usually made her captain's rounds when she was in the house. Housework is not exactly my forte, but I soon found that I had nothing to do in the evenings when Otterly wasn't home. I tried to do little and often, and I think the house was almost always in sight. Carol, at any rate, never found cause for criticism. I was lonely on weekdays, but in time I got used to it. On Fridays, when I came home from work and found Andorra and the girls there, It was wonderful. Very quickly, Andorra started cooking meals for all of us before heading out for her Friday shift. The bad times came during the week, especially when I came home from work to an empty house and woke up in the morning. Never mind that I felt resentful of Marjorie for what she had done. When after so many years of marriage you suddenly find yourself waking up alone in bed every morning, it takes some getting used to. There were some complications with the divorce. Marge and her gorgeous man had left the country and apparently traveled extensively. Judging from the fact that Marge's lawyer was having a hard time keeping in touch with her, I figured that perhaps her beau was deliberately trying to make things difficult. Eventually, I found out that his very upset wife was demanding that he pay child support for their children. I met with her one day when both she and my attorneys were meeting for a council of war. But honestly, I had my own problems and didn't want to get involved. I know she eventually managed to block all his accounts in British banks, and I believe she eventually got all his assets in the UK. Without interfering, I helped in any way I could by informing her lawyer of Marge's whereabouts when she called home to speak to our daughter. The credit for getting this information, however, goes to Otterly because she became adept at prying out Marge's exact whereabouts when she called. And then, not very cleverly, the little rascal would pass this information on to me at the first opportunity. Whether Otterly knew the reason I needed that information or not, I don't know. Strangely enough, the difficulties Marjorie's lawyer had encountered went in my favor. After another court hearing in which Marjorie's attorney asked the judge to call another recess because he was waiting for Marjorie to answer some question, the old man lost his temper. He demanded to know where Marjorie was, and when the poor lawyer was forced to admit he had no idea, the judge turned to me to ask if I had any knowledge of her whereabouts. "I'm sorry, sir," I replied, rising to my feet, "but I have not spoken or communicated directly with my wife since the day she decided to leave me and my daughter." I answered as best I could, glossing over the fact of Otterly's desertion, and formally, since there had been no word between Marjorie and me since her departure. Telling the truth. I sort of forgot to mention that Marjorie called Otterly every 3 weeks or so. But that's not what the judge was asking me, is it? And you know how these assholes pressure you into answering their off-the-cuff questions. I don't know for sure, but I have to assume the old man was having a bad day or something. Or maybe the old prick was presiding over divorce proceedings with the handsome Marjorie and lost his patience. Suddenly I heard him utter, "Unreasonable behavior, my grounds for divorce, can be interpreted in many ways." Briefly, he said that Marjorie's unwillingness to communicate with her own attorney was one of them. He then suggested that I had grounds for seeking a divorce, on the grounds of desertion. But be that as it may, he immediately granted my demand and gave me full custody of Otterly. I don't see how joint custody of the child can work in this case. If Mrs. Thomas cannot communicate effectively with her legal representative on this matter, what chance does Mr. Thomas have of sharing with her the important decisions regarding their daughter's well-being? Bick lectured Marjorie's attorney. "Mr. Thomas," said the old man, again addressing me directly, "as of today, I give you full and exclusive custody of Otterly, and completely terminate Mrs. Thomas's parental rights to the child, but with one caveat." The judge turned to Marjorie's attorney. "If Mrs. Thomas wishes to appear before me in person within 21 days, I may be able to persuade her to reconsider her decision. Will you endeavor to inform her of this?" Marjorie's lawyer replied that he would do his best to bring this information to her attention. After listening to the poor man's reply, the old man raised his eyebrows and turned his attention back to me. "Well, Mr. Thomas, I don't hold out much hope for that, and I doubt if I can be persuaded to change my mind. What surprises me is that you haven't demanded alimony from your wife." "Frankly, I don't see much chance of getting them, Your Honor." "Unless Marjorie ever returns to the country," I replied. The judge leaned forward and spoke briefly in a whisper to his secretary, and then began going through some papers looking for something on his desk. "I think we'll issue a temporary order for £100 a month after all. It's only a nominal amount to set a precedent. Like you, I very much doubt you will ever receive it. But if Mrs. Thomas returns to the jurisdiction of this court, we can adjust that amount in the future. I advise you to instruct your legal representatives to verify any assets Mrs. Thomas may have in the UK." That was it. I walked out of court a single man and with all the assets gained during the marriage. And apparently with any other assets that Marjorie had in the country, if I wished, if we could find them. I never bothered to look. Checking the call log at home the following Monday, I noticed that there had been an international call the day before. probably while I was mowing the lawn, which explains why I hadn't heard the phone ringing. The call obviously came from Marjorie. She was the only person calling from abroad. Strangely, neither Otterly nor Rachel mentioned the call, nor, as usual, informed me of Marjorie's whereabouts. One might assume they didn't, but I know I was guessing. Although since Otterly wasn't in court that week, I tried not to think about her divorce. I wondered how the girls knew about the 21 days. I doubt the social worker assigned by the court to look out for her interests would have told her. As time went on, Marjorie's calls to Otterly became more and more infrequent. This didn't surprise me, because from the few that were within earshot, I realized they were very one-sided. Not counting my daughter's subtle inquiries about exactly where Marjorie was, but those two stopped as soon as her posh man's divorce was settled. By the way, I have no idea how Otterly or Rachel found out about this information, that his divorce had already been settled. I seem to have concluded that since he's local, his kids probably went to the same school as the girls. Maybe the kids conspired and shared the information. But if so, the girls didn't tell me anything. I suppose the same reasoning could be used to explain the information the girls originally had about who, when, etc. When Marjorie first made her statement and moved out, adults too easily underestimate children's understanding of exactly what is going on. I can't remember now, but I think the divorce was final about 4 months ago. I took Otterly and Rachel to a movie one Saturday afternoon, and we were eating hamburgers at the local MKD's when Rachel announced that she and Mom would be moving home soon. I innocently inquired as to the reason, of course, and Rachel informed me that their apartment lease was up for renewal, but her mom thought the landlord wanted to raise the rent too much. No, at that moment I didn't see or realize what was going on, and that another conspiracy was afoot. I mean, come on, these were two 9-year-olds, and luring me out for an ice cream or two or even a day of vacation was completely expected. But the fact that they'd figured out and planned how to trick me into inviting Andorra and Rachel to move in with Otterly and me, I didn't even realize. They set the trap on Friday night when we all ate dinner together, prepared by Andorra before she left for her shift at the cab office. Otterly, seemingly innocently, asks Andorra if she's already found a suitable apartment. Before Andorra can answer, Rachel starts telling scary stories about places they've already seen, although Andorra manages to figure out that they aren't as bad as Rachel described them. Somehow, I completely overlooked the fact that if Rachel had seen those apartments, Otterly had too, because both girls were always together, regardless of which one of us, Andorra or me, was looking after them. Then Otterly made a suggestion that, had I been a little more skeptical, I should have seen coming a mile away. Yeah, we have a spare guest room upstairs, Otterly remarked. Why don't Rachel and Aunt Andor move in with us? Rachel has her own bed in my room anyway, and it would save us from having to constantly move from house to house. Actually, I have to admit, Otterly's idea struck me as a good one. It would save him from having to drive around town and Andor from having to pay rent, among other things. I looked at Andor for a clue, but she avoided meeting my gaze. I found myself in an awkward situation. If I had refused the offer right away, Andor might well have taken offense. But on the other hand, Andor might not like the idea and I might embarrass her if I put the ball in her hands. I decided the safest way out would be to confuse the situation a bit. Well, honey, you see, sometimes problems can arise when a man and a woman who aren't married live in the same house. You know, some people can get the wrong idea. I stuttered. To my surprise, Andor chuckled. Geez, Pete, you sound like a real prude. No, Andor, I was just thinking about your reputation. My reputation. You've got to be kidding me. You want to know the real reason we're being evicted from our apartment? It's because I disappear every week on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday nights. What's more, I used to get home in the mornings by cab, but now I drive a brand new car. I don't understand, the Nissan isn't new. Yes, next to my neighbor's cars. Some of them are sure I could only afford such a car if I had a certain night job. Andor sat and waited for me to digest her words, with an expression on her face. Are you kidding? I sighed. No, I'm not working. They wrote to my master. I told them all that I work at a cab company, and I even talked to some of them when they hailed a cab. But the rumors won't stop. My God, the sooner you get out of there, the better. That's what I thought, but finding another decent apartment I could afford isn't as easy as it seems. What about the Otterly idea, since there's plenty of room there? Are you sure? There was no enthusiasm in your words. Yes, I have no doubt about it. Without the girls, the place looks like a morgue, and besides, you're not half as bad a cook as I am. Should I take that as a compliment? As for my cooking, yes. The room is over there if you want it, Andor. Judging by the faces of those two, they can't wait. I gestured to the two grinning faces of the children. We'll have to discuss the rent, Andor suggested. No, I don't think we'll have to. Housekeeping isn't among my favorite things to do, and I've already told you that you're a better cook than I am. Maybe you could be something of a house cook around here? Pete, I'd do it anyway, but I'd have to pay you something, at least for heating, electricity, and housekeeping tax, Andor insisted. Let's leave that for later. Right now I have to ask you if you're sure you want to move here. If you're inviting us, then yes, we'd love to. Then let's assume the deal is done. When do you want to move in? Oh yes, how about… Well, this apartment is furnished. Don't worry, most of my stuff isn't worth worrying about. A lot of it can be thrown away. I sold all the good stuff years ago, right after Tony left when I was short of money. What happened? I asked. But I knew from the look in Andora's eyes that she would tell me when the kids weren't around. I had been married to Marjorie long enough to recognize that expression. I was aware that Andora's husband had been killed in a traffic accident a few years ago, but I didn't know the details. A while later, when we went to walk Andor in the Nissan, I heard a distinct smacking sound behind me and turned around to see what it was, and found Otterly and Rachel standing there looking at me with a butter won't melt in your mouth look on their faces. The girls moved into the house the following week. Most of Andor's furniture had been thrown out, but some things still made their way into the house. Other things were stored in the garage, and her TV and music center ended up in the girls' bedroom. The house was suddenly complete again. Even the guys at work noticed my improved mood. They also noticed that I wasn't drinking with them as much after work. And I had a daughter, well, two daughters I could bring home and read them bedtime stories every night. And my traveling pretty much ended when Marge left. Not knowing how things would go, I slowed down a bit. My boss got over it and started sending other guys instead. I, in turn, no longer agreed to travel voluntarily if I could help it. Soon after moving to Andorra, I began to fall in love with this woman, although at the time I thought I was very good at not showing it. What did you expect? Andorra was a pretty tidbit of real estate by any measure. Maybe a year or so younger than me, she seemed to be able to appear flawless no matter what she was or wasn't wearing. Sure, I'd seen her walk between the guest room and the bathroom a few times wrapped only in a bath sheet, but that was about it. Andor had a killer sense of humor and never seemed to resent the girls, or me, no matter what the little pranksters got up to. She apparently paid no attention to my idiosyncrasies. Look, I never claimed I wouldn't become a bloodthirsty angel if I lived with her. I was in love with Andor from the first time I laid eyes on her, so that was to be expected. I think Carol was the first to realize I was in love. That Christmas, she and Frank had the whole family over for Boxing Day. Andor was fussing over the dinner she was making. Have you told her yet? Carol asked as we set the table together in the dining room. Who and what did you tell? I replied. Andorra, of course, brother. Sorry, kid, you lost me. What was I supposed to tell her? That you're in love with her, you fool, Carol announced. In what? Don't be silly, Carol. Come on, Pete, I read you like a book. You're even more in love with Andorra than you are with Stephanie Mathers. Oh, I better explain about Stephanie Mathers. She was my first love when we were all in high school together. My friend Carol and I idolized this girl for several years before I got up the courage to ask her out. She led me on for a while and then broke my heart, leaving me for dead. Stephanie was immediately and irrevocably declared persona non grata by my sister and her friends. Some of them comforted me in the months that followed. God, they made sure I forgot about Stephanie as soon as possible. Of course, I've grown attached to her. She's a very sweet person, Carol. But I'm in a delicate situation. The status quo suits us both. If I do anything to upset the balance, oh God, I might break the apple cart. Peter, this woman is as much in love with you as you are with her. You dance around each other like schoolboys in love. What the hell are you talking about, Carol? Pete, to get from one end of the room to the other, you both take the long way around, so there's no chance, God forbid, of you touching each other. So we don't want to invade each other's personal space. Nonsense. There are only two reasons two people living in the same house can do that. Either you hate each other, which I somehow doubt because no one has ever heard a single word. slip between you, or you're in love with each other. And don't try to fool me. You've never once exchanged a suggestive joke. That's unusual for two people who spend so much time in close proximity to each other. Think back to the jokes you exchanged with the girls at the office. No, you're both too afraid of ruining what you have. So you think Andor has a thing for me? My God, Pete, she dances the same way you do. You both dance to the same tune. Even the girls can see that. So what am I supposed to do? Hell no, Peter. Tell her how you feel, I guess. Come on, she's not the first woman you've called to work your golden tongue. You had a knack for getting girls until you got involved with that bitch. You never liked Marjorie, did you? No, I never trusted her. I felt like she had you wrapped around her finger and then led you around by the nose. About the same way Otterly and Rachel are doing it now, but I doubt you'll ever see it. The difference is that those two little girls really love you, and I never thought Marjorie did. Oh, you are mistaken, Carol. Of course Marjorie loved me when we were married. Think what you like, Pete. You have seen love. I've seen a girl who got off easy. You had a hell of a job for a young man your age, and you brought home the bacon. Christ, Frank wasn't making half your paycheck when I married him. I was always sure Marjorie only saw you as a pound sign. No, you're wrong, Carol. Never mind. It doesn't matter now, does it? Peter, someone has given you a second chance at happiness. There's a woman in the kitchen who I'm sure is in love with you. You just need to find a way to melt the ice. No sooner had the conversation gone any farther than we heard Andor approaching. She had entered the dining room to see how the preparations were going, and Carol and I had to change the subject. During this meal, Carol kept catching my eye and making subtle gestures with her head in Andor's direction. She also seemed to enjoy private conversation with Otterly and Rachel, but I don't think anyone noticed. Over the next few days, I almost broached the subject of Andorra a few times, but ducked at the last minute. It was New Year's Eve, and Andorra was working. Carol and Frank picked up the girls so I could go to a party with friends from the office. I didn't want to leave the girls, but everyone insisted. A conspiracy again? I don't think so. Too many unrelated people. What happened that night must have been a coincidence. It was about 4 in the morning and the party was winding down. Those who were going home had already dispersed to their homes, and most of the others had gone about their business. Unable to find a single comfortable free place to sleep and having drunk too much falling water to even think about going home, well, unless I wanted to get there in one piece, I hailed a cab. Hey, gorgeous, why don't you send one of the guys to drive me home? Maybe those aren't exactly the words I used, but that's roughly what I said to Andor when she answered the call at the cab service. Are you crazy, Pete? Andor asked. You bet I am, babe. I had a hard time deciding which of those two phones to call. I'll send one of the guys over in 5 minutes. Thanks, honey. Oh, and Pete. Yes, beautiful? Try not to throw up in the back seat. Have you ever seen me throw up when I'm wasted? I've never seen you drunk, Peter. I can't imagine what you'd do. Would you be surprised? You bet I would. Now Phil is hitting the road, and please don't make a mess in his car. We've got enough guys trying to get the smell of vomit out of their cars as it is. Your word is my command, my love. If that's all you meant. What? Never mind, Phil's already out the door. Why don't you try to find your way to his car? Andor said, laughing. Then the line cut off. Jesus, Pete, you're bleeding from your skin, said driver Phil, who obviously knew who I was, even if I didn't know who he was, helping me into the back seat of his cab. But when he got behind the wheel, even while intoxicated, I realized he wasn't headed for my house. You're going the wrong way, I told him, or rather, frowned at him. You're going to need someone to put you to bed, and I have no intention of doing you that honor. I think I know someone who will. It's pretty quiet around here right now. One of the guys can sit on the bleeding phones for the rest of the night. Honestly, I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, Phil and Andor were already dragging me from the back seat of the car. I may have actually acted a little helpless, especially when Andor clutched at my arm to help me get to the door and through it. However, I needed Phil's help to successfully climb the stairs to the bedroom. As soon as he left, I started acting like a possum again, and Andor started unbuttoning my clothes, trying to make me comfortable. You know you can do stupid things when you're intoxicated. You can say things you'd never dare to say when you're sober. It was a great opportunity for me to try my luck. But perhaps the booze didn't help me choose the best words. Suddenly, the perfect opportunity presented itself. Andor leaned over to me, looking straight into my eyes from very close range. You know, You're one hell of an attractive little Andor, I muttered. And what does that mean? She asked. That you're good enough to eat and I'm hungry. I muttered this inaudibly, probably with a drunken smirk on my face. Oh yeah, really? Well, I suspect that if you ate something you wouldn't be able to eat for long. How much have you had to drink tonight? Not much. Jesus, Pete, you're as angry as a newt. Yeah, but if I drank a little more, I'd have the courage to tell you how much I love you. A wide smile appeared on Andor's face. I'll believe it when you tell me sober. Now get some sleep and we'll see how bad your head is in the morning. Good night, Peter, she added, getting up and leaving the room. No, you can't go, I insisted. I might get sick and suffocate. Then where will I sleep? I grabbed Andora's hand as she stood up and gently pulled her to fall onto the bed beside me, but she made no attempt to get up. Nothing more was said, and eventually I apparently dozed off. Probably pretty quickly since I had so much booze in me. Andora was right. The daylight streaming in through the bedroom windows was not helping my condition, and I was somewhat disappointed to find that she was no longer in the bed next to me. I wanted to lift my head from the pillow, but suddenly realized that was a bad idea. I must have groaned in pain. Here, drink this, I heard Andor's voice from behind me. What is it? I asked, shielding my eyes from the sunlight as I rolled over to look in her direction. Well, it can't be poison until you marry me, right? I need to make sure I can ensure your life before I blow you off. How do you know I won't turn the table over and nail you first? I replied. If Andor wants to play comedian, I figured I'd try to be witty too. No, you can't do that. You have 2 daughters to take care of. One of them is yours. They don't see it that way, Peter. They like to think of themselves as sisters, and they both think of you as their father. Do you? I guess I'm considered Otterly's mother now, too. Haven't you noticed that Aunt Andor has stopped being a mom lately? She's called me mom several times in the last week. Yeah? I hadn't noticed. I know. And you didn't pay much attention when Rachel started calling you daddy a few weeks ago. Oh, I'm not very observant, am I? She actually called me her daddy? Daddy to be exact, Peter. She's been calling you daddy for about a month now. Even Carol and Frank have noticed it. Oh, and you discussed it with Carol at Boxing Day? I discussed a lot of things with Carol at Boxing Day, Peter. Ah, that explains it then. What? Why, she's already planning her wedding outfit. I replied with as big a smile as possible, considering I had that little guy with Thor's hammer running around in my head. Andor sat up and looked at me, still holding the potion she had prepared for me in her hand. So? I asked after she obviously hadn't answered in ages. Andor sat with a confused expression on her face. I expected her to ask a question in response to my remark, but it didn't come out the way I had hoped. So? She replied. So are you going to marry me or not? You didn't ask me to. I know I'm a coward. I was trying to get you to answer before I asked. It's much better not to look like a prize plum when I get turned down. Well, we'll see. I guess you won't look like a fruitcake if you ask, but... Andor replied. But what? I have a confession to make to you before you commit to it. That sounds serious. Should I be worried? No, but it is. I'm not a widow, Peter. Tony's not dead. In fact, legally speaking, I was never married to him. Or rather, I was married, but I didn't get out. I think I'm losing something in the translation, Andor. Tony was a bigamist, Pete. He was already married when he married me, so legally, my marriage to him is invalid. Oops. You can say that? Tony actually married 3 of us at different times, and he fled the country during the trial. That's why I told Rachel he's dead. If he's ever found, he'll be in jail for years. Not that I think they'll do that. The bastards have probably already tricked some other stupid cow into marrying him. So you're not a widow and have never been married, I said. No, technically I'm an unmarried mom. It's just a lot less complicated to tell everyone I'm a widow. In that case, would you do me the honor of... I never waited for the question to continue, and Andor never waited for an answer. I'm not even sure where the damn drink she brought me went. But we spent the next hour or so rolling around on the bed and the floor like a couple of teenagers. My headache was almost forgotten. No, it wasn't. We just kissed and hugged and whispered silly, affectionate words to each other. It was fun, although my head still hurt. With a head like that, I could hardly perform. By the time Frank brought the girls home, it was about 3 in the afternoon. Andor and I were sitting in the kitchen, making plans and thinking about how to break the news to the girls. But we didn't have to tell them anything. The little rascals seemed to get it right away. Maybe because Andor was almost sitting on my lap when they came in the door. Anyway, they stopped where they were, looked at us for a few seconds, then greeted each other again, and then went around the table and hugged us both. I think we both thought we had flashing neon signs on our heads when Frank, entering the kitchen, did a quick double take and simply said, "Congratulations, when?" Which Andor and I translated as, "What date have we set for the wedding?" This prompted further discussion, which included Carol, who had gotten a call from Frank. Eventually, a date was set, rather arbitrarily, mid-February. Andor and I wanted a rather modest celebration, while our girls wanted something more extravagant. I think we settled on something in between. We decided to have the wedding itself at the registry office and afterwards to have a rather lavish but small reception. Neither Andor nor I had many living relatives. The registry office was chosen because I didn't have to read the announcements and worry about entries in the parish newspaper. Announcements like "Maiden of this parish" and "In the presence of her daughter" might have confused some people. Andor was to become a widow. After Frank went home, Andor had the delicate task of giving her application to the supervisor at the taxicab office. My wife wouldn't work the night shift for anything in the world, for reasons too numerous to mention, and personal pride or distrust are not part of the equation. It's more of a personal preference. It pissed me off to sleep, or rather, not sleep, alone. That night, Andor and I had another big decision to make when it came time to go to bed. In the end, we decided to separate into separate bedrooms until the wedding. We both realized that it would be hard for us to justify to the girls when they got older our stance on extramarital sex if they saw us living in the same room before the wedding. But that doesn't mean I didn't develop the habit of running home for lunch on most days as soon as the girls went back to school. Sure, I took a few long lunches, but no one in the office minded, most likely because of the further improvement in my overall mood. The following weekend, Andor worked her last shifts at the taxi company. It took several cabs on Sunday morning to take all the flowers and boxes of chocolates home. Then, we had to limit the girls for a few weeks. It wasn't Sunday night in Andorra. Some of the drivers and their wives took us out for dinner and fun at a local pub. Cabs were in short supply in town that evening. The wedding took place almost before we had time to think about it. It went very well, considering our girls were impeccable bridesmaids. I think Andorra and Carol spent more time making them look perfect than my bride did. But, as I think I've said before, Andor can look good in just about anything. Andor and I didn't have a honeymoon per se. We spent one night in the bridal suite at the luxury hotel where the reception was held. The girls went home for the night with Frank and Carol's family. Our master plan was to get away with the girls for most of the school summer vacation that year. That first year, we spent 5 weeks traveling through Florida, the Caribbean, and Southern California. Not staying anywhere for more than a few days, we saw just about everything there was to see and experience in the allotted time. It was only a week or two after the wedding, and upon returning home from work in the evening, I immediately realized something was wrong. The girls looked quite happy, but Andor was annoyed about something. It wasn't until the girls went to bed that she told me what was bothering her. "Does Rachel know that Tony isn't dead?" She informed me as soon as I went downstairs, tucked both girls in, and read each a chapter from their book. "God, how did she know?" I asked in surprise. I was sure we had never discussed the subject while the girls were in the house. "I have no idea, although I've suspected something was wrong ever since we moved here. Remember those pictures by the girls' beds? Well, the beds in the girls' room were parallel to each other. There were 3 small closets, one on each side and a third in the middle. On the center one hung 2 pictures of Andorra and me. On the outermost hung pictures of Marjorie and Tony respectively. Andorra explained that lately she had noticed that the girls often put Marjorie and Tony's pictures in the drawers. It suddenly dawned on me that I hadn't seen any of the pictures that evening. Finally, Andorra asked the girls why they were hiding the pictures. Rachel replied, "They don't need us. We don't want to look at their pictures." Further conversation proved to Andor that Rachel knew perfectly well that her father had not died in a traffic accident but had run away, although she didn't seem to know why. Andorra, out of embarrassment, decided to leave Rachel in the dark. She didn't want to have to explain to the child that she was technically an illegitimate child. And although Andorra had been worried for some time about Rachel's reaction to the information that her father was on the loose, the child didn't seem to mind. Personally, I thought the information helped the girls feel closer to each other. Andor turned out to be the perfect wife. Even better than the perfect wife, she was an amazing mother to both of our girls. Not only was she great with the kids, but she was extremely patient with me when things got hectic in the office. Yes, no matter what Otterly claims, I have flaws, but Andor doesn't seem to notice them, never once mentioning them. She has the most wonderful sense of humor and has come up with many ways to cheer me up in the evening and tease me until the kids go to bed. Or we do. Sometimes my nights can be very exhausting. By early summer, the number of phone calls from Marjorie to Otterly had pretty much dropped to zero. I'm not surprised that Otterly changed course, went on the offensive, and became very persistent when Marjorie did call. I know she was mad at her mother, but both Andorra and I had to step in and reprimand Otterly for calling Andorra new mommy in her conversation with Marjorie. Otterly brushed off this antics and instead proceeded to talk about how much fun we have as a family going out to visit, regularly mentioning Daddy's wife and my sister Rachel. Andor and I had several discussions about Otterly's attitude toward Marjorie and how she talks to her on the phone. But in the end, we concluded that it would be impossible to make an endless list of words and phrases that Otterly is forbidden to use toward her. Otterly, with Rachel's connivance, is bound to come up with new ones, no matter what we forbid. We decided that Marjorie had made her own bed that day in the kitchen. Now she would have to get used to lying in the damn thing. No sooner had we returned from vacation than Otterly and Rachel started talking about Mom and Dad again. It took Andorra and I a long time to figure out what they were implying, but then it came to us that they were asking if we were really their mom and dad, and I blamed the internet. Suddenly, Andorra and I started finding printouts all over the house about the adoption process, with, we assumed, the intention of encouraging Andorra to adopt Otterly and me to adopt Rachel. The girls also researched the legal intricacies of changing Rachel's name to Thomas and even printed out the appropriate forms. As for the idea of adoption, after some discussion, Andor and I decided that it should be either one or both of them. Rachel's father, although he had relinquished her and Andor, still retained legal rights to her. We ended up putting the problem in the hands of the same attorney who handled my divorce. It took over a year, but eventually we were able to get Tony's parental rights terminated and both adoptions took place. Coincidentally, or by our attorney's intent, the same judge who handled my divorce case presided over Tony's termination of parental rights, and I strongly suspect that may have had something to do with his decision. Legally, our family now consisted of Mr. and Mrs. Thomas and our daughters Otterly and Rachel. We discussed the possibility of adding to the family, but ultimately decided not to add to it, which was the plan. Shortly after the wedding, I was promoted at work, and with the promotion came a larger salary and the ability to delegate more responsibilities. Our summer trips became regular, and I really think Andor planned them as a sort of compensation for not having time to travel when I was younger. In our second year of marriage, we spent 5 weeks traveling around Europe. On the third, we visited India, a surprisingly large country, and Sri Lanka. On the fourth, we visited Australia and New Zealand, and yes, we miscalculated by going there in the middle of winter. But we're British, and it was hard for us to notice the difference. By the time our fifth summer came around, we knew a lot about traveling. Otterly and Rachel, who were each 14 by then, had their own video cameras and were already busily documenting our trips. Canada, the northern US, and Alaska were planned for that year, and for most of the winter and spring, all three of my girls made detailed plans. By then, I had left them to themselves, only occasionally mentioning the name of some unusual place I had heard of years ago and knowing that we would stop there sometime during the trip. But there was one thing I don't think either of us thought about. About 2 years after we were married, Andor and I started getting Christmas cards from Marjorie. Otterly always got Christmas and birthday cards from her. But we had no idea why she suddenly decided to send Christmas cards to us. We couldn't reciprocate because none of the cards had a return address. However, the thing is, and I suppose the rest of the family didn't pay attention to this, they all had Canadian stamps on them. This led anyone who thought about it to believe that Marjorie and Ronald had settled somewhere in this country. Unfortunately, Marjorie was rarely mentioned in our house anymore, and I don't think she called Otterly on the phone for several years, so no one brought it up. As always, the master plan for our extended summer vacation that year changed as we went along. When the girls informed me that there was no chance of us visiting all the places we wanted to in the time allotted, and this after we had severely cut down the list. In the end, we decided to do an arbitrary line across the continent, as we had already done a few years ago. We'll visit the West this summer and leave the East for another year. We arrived in Winnipeg on an Air Canada flight in late June, and after spending a day or two exploring the city's historic sites, this isn't a travelogue, so I won't go into detail, we set out on the tour in a rental car. From Manitoba, we drove west to Saskatchewan, then turned south and almost back through the Dakotas, Nebraska, and Kansas before turning west and then north again, driving through Colorado and Wyoming, where we spent a few days at what we called a dude ranch. The horses were a pleasure to ride, but I think I'll stick to English saddles in the future. As comfortable as the Western-type saddles were, I had a feeling that it would not be easy to get out of them if something went wrong. However, I didn't have the slightest confidence that it would. The rain on my neck was also an interesting experience. There are two theories about how horses or motorcycles are ridden when they get hit by wheels. Stay where you are and hope you manage to regain control, or back up and hope you fall to the ground, get back on your feet and run. The prospect of being on a horse or motorcycle with a squealing engine and spinning rear wheel landing on me was never my idea of a good time. Eventually, we entered Montana and stopped in a town I had heard about somewhere and had always wanted to visit. I must have read about this place in some Western. After checking into a hotel, motel, or whatever it was called, we headed to a restaurant, probably a diner we had seen nearby. The restaurant was crowded and a little noisy, with all the customers chatting with each other. But suddenly there was a great rumble, followed by absolute silence. Everyone fell silent. As always happens in such cases, one of the waitresses dropped a tray of food for the poor. It's one of those reflex actions that you can't control, isn't it? Andor and I, as well as everyone else in the place, started looking around to see who exactly had so clumsily prevented us from eating by dropping the tray. A rather rash move, for surely the culprit would have been embarrassed enough to make a fuss. He certainly didn't want to be stared at by all the passers-by in the place. I quickly found the culprit and to my surprise, recognized her. What's more, it was obvious that she'd noticed me too. And upon reflection, I realized that it was probably recognition that had made her drop the damn tray. The poor woman stood there with her mouth open and her eyes widened, staring straight at me. I could tell from Andora's reaction that she recognized the woman too. Anyway, both Andora and I had to react by saying almost the same thing to our girls in unison. "Eat your dinner, Rachel. Aish, Otterly, you have nothing to worry about." Andor turned to Rachel and I turned to Otterly. Although they were our girls now, we had both legally adopted each other's daughters. Even after 5 years, we were still inclined to punish our own child first. It didn't matter, though. Both kids were fidgeting in their seats, trying to get a glimpse of the woman responsible for the commotion. Recognizing the woman, Otterly turned around almost instantly, muttered, "So be it," under her breath, and then went back to her food, as if nothing had happened. Rachel stared after her for a moment before the waitress turned and left the public area of the restaurant. Then she looked at me, smiled sweetly, then shifted her gaze to her mother and went back to eating, just as Otterly had done. After the waitress left, many customers looked in our direction. Perhaps some were looking in our direction before the waitress left as well, but I didn't notice. Either way, they all realized that the incident was caused by my relatives and/or my presence. Andor and I and the girls tried to ignore the stares and continued our meal as best we could. "I guess the grass wasn't as green as it looked," Andor whispered to me as we followed the two girls and ran to the car. "What do you mean?" I replied, perhaps a little more sharply than I meant to. "Sam, I think it's safe to assume she's no longer with Ronaldo if she's working here. Most likely one of them cheated on the other. They say once you cheat, you'll always cheat," I replied. "But she didn't cheat on you. That stupid bitch just dumped you and Otterly. You're not trying to fool me that they didn't consummate their relationship before the divorce. Besides, in my opinion, abandoning your daughter is tantamount to cheating. You can be sure that either she couldn't keep her legs crossed or he couldn't keep them in his pants. Does it matter? Not unless she's trying to cause trouble here and now. Otterly's already messed up enough, there's no need to give her any more shocks. It's too late for her to try anything like that, Pete. Besides, I think Otterly handled it a lot better than you did. After all, it was the girls who— Don't say that, Andor. I know exactly what those girls did, and I'm glad we have a couple of little manipulators. Though sometimes I have to wonder how far their manipulations go. What do you mean? Nothing much, but it was obvious they were working out a plan. Sometimes I wonder how far in advance they planned it all out. Don't worry. I couldn't be more pleased than I am right now. I just get curious sometimes. By this time we had gotten to the car. I unlocked the doors with the remote as we pulled up and the kids jumped into the back seats. I opened the near front door and held it open for Andorra. But she didn't sit down. She came over to me, wrapped her arms around my neck and kissed me. The two little devils sitting in the back seat of the car murmured and shouted approvingly. This was followed by comments like, "Not in public," and "Could you two please wait until you get to your room?" One would think that these were rather disrespectful and cavalier comments coming from two 14-year-olds, but both of our daughters were very mature for their age. My goodness, how quickly they had to grow up. Andor had lost her husband when Rachel was 6 and had lived alone for many years. Otterly saw her mother walk out on us and almost publicly disowned her when she was 8. I assure you, I bore that event badly, but my daughter, with Rachel's help, began to behave like a much more mature person. Very suddenly, Andor interrupted the kiss and pulled away slightly. "We have an audience," she whispered, peering over my shoulder. I looked over and saw Marjorie standing in the kitchen doorway watching us. "Do you think Otterly should?" Andor suggested. "Yeah, I don't think we have a choice," I replied. I was well aware that I would have to go back later to talk to Marjorie, or rather confront her, and that would likely lead to us arranging for Otterly to meet with her mother alone. Frankly, this was too good an opportunity to pass up. We'll deal with that side of things anyway. "Sturley," Andor, leaning against the car, spoke while I was still pondering. "Your mom's there. I think you should go visit her." "Should I?" Otterly replied. "She's your mother, Otterly. Now please do what we ask you to do, or you'll regret missing this opportunity many years from now when you're older." Otterly shrugged and started to climb out of the car. "I don't want to see her. Maybe Rachel can come with me?" "No, we're just here. We won't be out of your sight," Andor assured her. Stepping out of the car, Otterly, with noticeable reluctance, and after throwing a few dejected glances at us, made her way toward her mother and stopped 10 feet away from her. Marjorie apparently said something we couldn't hear, and took a step toward her, but Otterly immediately took a step back. It was a little frustrating that we couldn't hear what they were saying to each other, although I think Otterly did talk a lot. We noticed that if Marjorie approached Otterly, the baby would back away. "That's not good," Andorra muttered, apparently so Rachel wouldn't hear her. But as soon as she said it, Otterly turned and ran back to the car, jumped into her seat without a word, slammed the door shut, and started to put on her seatbelt. When I looked back, the doorway where Marjorie had been standing was empty, and I assumed she had gone back inside. I would have preferred to get in my car and get out of there, but Andor had a different plan, and she must have been halfway to the door before Otterly had time to fasten her seatbelt. So I stood there like a lemon for about 10 minutes until Andor came back. I threw Andor a questioning look at her when she finally climbed back into the car. In response, I got one of those looks where Andor seemed to be looking at me, but her eyes quickly ran over to the two girls in the back seat. The message was, "Shut up and drive. We'll discuss this later." After lunch, we planned to walk the path along the river and see the waterfalls that the town was named after. We were under the impression that the hydroelectric dams had stolen some of their original grandeur, but they were still impressive. As is usually the case on these hikes, Andor and I never overstretch ourselves if at all possible. Two girls had gotten ahead of us, and it allowed Andor and I to talk. "So what did she say?" "He left, dumped her 2 years ago when he hooked up with some waitress in this town." "That's as we suspected, but I wonder why she didn't go home to the UK. "He left, leaving her with a motel bill. The motel was understaffed in the restaurant, so she figured she could stay and work off the bill. Apparently, she's sharing a room with another woman. Anyway, they both work in the restaurant during the day, and at night they deliver drinks at the bar behind the road." "Sounds like fun. What else is she supposed to do, Pete?" "Have fun every night with some jerk at the bar, I suppose." "No need to be nasty, Peter. Marjorie made a mistake, and now she seems to be paying for it. Anyway, you'll meet her when she finishes work at the restaurant at 6 o'clock. She only has a couple hours before she has to be on bar duty, so you can chat while I take the kids out for a snack. And Dora, what the hell am I supposed to tell her? You need to finish, Peter, no matter what you believe. You need to sit down and talk to her. And remember that she's Otterly's mother. Would you want her to remember that? Marjorie said the same thing, Peter. She's sorry for what she did, and I think she'd like to apologize to both Otterly and you. Unfortunately, I don't think Otterly is ready to accept that apology just yet. That was obvious from what happened at lunch. But in time, I'm sure she will. We'll just have to make sure we don't lose her again. Are you being magnanimous, considering what Tony did to you? Pete, is there any point in going through life with hate in your heart? What Tony did to me is worse than what Marjorie did to you, or even Otterly. You know, for a while I hated him and the other women he tricked into marrying him. And then one day, we were all sitting in the waiting room at the police station, and I realized we were all in the same boat. We'd all been tricked, and none of us were to blame, so we became friends. Tony, what's the point of wasting time cursing that bastard? If he ever shows up, I'll report him to the police as soon as I get the chance. But I'm not going to waste time and emotion on hating him. I have more important people to worry about. Andor pulled me to him and kissed my cheek. Besides, think about it. If Marjorie hadn't run off with that what's-his-name, where would we be now? Good point, Andor. I know it's my love. We'd better hurry. It's 4 o'clock. I waited in the restaurant parking lot for Marjorie to come off duty. She came out with another very dark-haired woman who scrutinized me carefully before moving on. Marjorie looked nervous, not the confident woman I had last seen in the kitchen when she was laying down the law all those years ago. However, she still looked quite attractive. Hi, Peter. Thanks for coming. The bar must be quiet at this time of day. Why don't we go in there and talk? I remained silent in response, but gestured for her to take the initiative. I followed Marjorie to a booth at the back of the bar. It was obvious that we were expected. I noticed that the dark-haired woman behind the bar was talking to the bartender when we entered. I also noticed that all the booths next to ours were empty. The dark-haired woman walked behind us and placed 2 mugs of beer on the table, and then said something to Marjorie, I think in Spanish. Marjorie only nodded in response. I assumed she had picked up the language during her wanderings. You wanted to see me, Marjorie? I said, reminding her that I hadn't asked for this meeting. I just wanted to apologize, Peter, she finally whispered. Only now did I catch her words. No, you did me a big favor, I replied. Come on, I'm not cut out to be a bloodthirsty diplomat. Yes, Andor got the better end of the deal. I should have realized that she would latch onto you as soon as I left, she replied bitterly. It was the other way around, Marjorie, as soon as I laid eyes on Andorra. I am not quite sure how I meant to finish that sentence. Perhaps I thought that if I had met Andor before Marjorie left, I might have been the one to perform the act of walking. Perhaps I am passing off wishful thinking, but somehow I doubt I would have done so. I am the sort of person who is too bound by duty and other things to act so selfishly. Sometimes you wonder if it's a failure. What happened to Laverboy after all? I asked Marjorie. And where did that rascal get all his money? You know he left his wife and children without a penny, so she seized all his bank accounts. Ronald's money? What a laugh. You mean everyone else's money? He was a crook, Peter. He's wanted everywhere. I wouldn't be surprised if that's why he eventually abandoned me. I helped him with some of his scams, and we had to leave Argentina quickly when my picture hit the local papers. I think he crossed the border into Canada when he found out the FBI showed up at the motel looking for him. Coincidentally, with one of the waitresses from the diner. Ironically, I'm now doing the job of that bleeding waitress. Wasn't the FBI after you? No, pretty much, yes, but I made a deal with them. If I was willing to testify against Ronald when they got to him, they agreed not to throw the book at me. And in return, I got a slap on the wrist. 2 years probation for aiding a fugitive to escape or some other nonsense. Mind you, I'm stuck in the country until they find the creep, and I'll have to report to the authorities every week or so. But that doesn't interfere too much because Buster, the deputy sheriff to whom I report, is here or at the diner most of the time. Are you still in debt? I was up to my eyeballs in them. As a prune, I signed over almost everything, including Ronald's rental car, and that bitch drove off in it. I've paid off almost everything, but there's still a few $1,000s of debt left. No, Pete, I can't. Marjorie saw me pull out my checkbook. For once in your life, do as you're told, Marjorie. Okay, I'll draw this up for £5,000, that's $10,000. It'll get you out of debt and give you something to lean on if you need it. If in the future you decide to come back to the UK, when and if they catch a creep, we'll help you find a place to live and get settled. But don't think that gives you the right to interfere and spoil our family. Oh, and you know the court stripped you of all parental rights to Otterly, don't you? She made that clear to me this morning. Oh, I'm sorry, that's not why we sent her. That's what I realized when Andor walked into the kitchen. Pete, I was stupid. I really never meant to hurt you and Otterly like that. I don't know. I just got confused by all of Ronald's exciting stories. It wasn't very interesting, I assure you. Marjorie, it was all a long time ago. To tell you the truth, I'm just glad you're safe and sound. But Otterly and I have a new life now, and I'm afraid you're no longer a part of it. Though Andor and I will do our best to keep Otterly in touch with you. That's more than I deserve, Peter, and I really don't deserve this check. Well, you'd better take it. It will ease my conscience a little when we leave here tomorrow. In the morning we shall come to the dining room to breakfast. Perhaps we can persuade Otterly to speak to you civilly once more. I don't deserve the kindness you show me, Peter. No, Marjorie. I had to prove myself right, even though I tried to convince myself otherwise. But you are Otterly's mother, and there's nothing I can do about it. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to go back to my family. Sure, sorry, Pete. I got up and left without looking back. When I tracked down the girls, you could tell they were all waiting for me, holding their breath. I think that's the right expression. I took Andor aside and briefly told her about my conversation with Marjorie and the money I'd given her. She doesn't deserve you. That was Andor's only comment when I mentioned the check. That's basically what she said, I replied, kissing my wife. But you want to get it. Thank you, was all she replied to that comment. A little later, I contacted Otterly privately and was about to start the routine on You Only Have One Birth Mother when she informed me that Andorra and Rachel had already arrived. From that point on, the conversation did not go as I had planned. Otterly informed me that she would now be happy to talk to her mother the next morning and would try to keep her mouth shut. At the same time, she made it a condition that she would not be alone with her mother and that Rachel or I should be present beside her. When I inquired why, I was curtly informed that one of us was always present during the fun. I don't know how I took that statement. I left it without comment. The next morning, Marjorie, Otterly, and Rachel sat at a neighboring table and talked for a long time. I can only assume that Marjorie's friends had her back because she must have had a job to do. The only part of the conversation that Andorra and I overheard was the two kids raving about how well the roses were growing in the garden near their house. Anyway, all three of them were smiling most of the time. As we were pulling away, Marjorie walked to the car and kissed both girls goodbye. She then turned to Andor and I. These two are very lucky they have found themselves the best mom and dad in the world. Saying that, she caught me off guard and then turned and ran back into the restaurant. I think she cried on the run. I kissed my wife, then we got in the car and drove north to the border in Calgary. From the way they looked in the rearview mirror, I don't think any of the kids looked back or were particularly concerned that we had left that city behind. Epilogue. After we returned home that year, Marjorie kept in touch with her. Andor, I believe, made a habit of writing to her fairly regularly. We never found out whether the FBI had tracked down Ronald. But less than a year later, we learned that Marjorie was going to marry her deputy sheriff, or whatever his name was. We gathered as a family, and after much heartache, it was decided that we would decline the family's invitation to attend Marjorie's wedding. But I managed to slip in there alone for a few days to attend. Don't ask me why, but for some reason I felt I had to do it. Buster, or Buddy, as everyone called him, turned out to be a really nice guy once I got to know him better. He even picked me up at the airport and introduced me to all his friends and family. I learned from Buddy that Marjorie had been very frank and open with him from the beginning. She confessed everything she had done and told him how much she regretted her actions in the past. It turned out that Buddy had arranged with several of his trucker buddies to send her Christmas cards, etc. to us from various cities in Canada. I believe Marjorie was trying to hide from us the true circumstances she was in. It's a bit odd to give your ex-wife away at her wedding, but apparently some idiot had to do the job. Maybe that's why I went to put an end to it all. I don't think Otterly and Rachel guessed where I disappeared to for those 5 days, but they could have guessed. Those two were always one step ahead of me in just about everything. And, to be honest, they and Andor are still ahead of me. Over the next few years, we got the news that Marjorie had given birth to two boys. But we never got to see them, except in pictures. Now that they're a little older, I suppose the boys interact with Otterly and Rachel fairly regularly, but neither of my daughters mention them or Marjorie to me very often. Otterly and Rachel ended up marrying two brothers. Sometimes I feel very sorry for those poor girls. The girls are still incredibly close to each other and definitely play an important role in these marriages. When our two girls have an intrigue together, it takes a man to come out of it victorious. I don't think I've ever been able to do that. They have two children each, and, suspiciously from my point of view, in both cases the girls were born remarkably close to each other, both in date and physically. Andor and I have enjoyed watching our grandchildren grow up and become very much like their mothers. I stepped down as managing director last year, and Andor and I are now enjoying an 8-month round-the-world trip. We are contemplating whether we will find a place where we want to settle down. But honestly, I think our daughters and their families will pull us home to the UK again. We haven't sold the house. The girls wouldn't let us because of the roses. God knows how much time they spend there tending it all. But we get regular reports. Just this morning, while checking the mail, I got a picture of my garden from them, entitled, "It's been a good year for roses. Life goes on." The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, so subscribe to my channel and watch for the next video.